Naturalising Knowledge Management, a 78-minute presentation held at the Whitworth Conference Centre, Shrivenham, on the 20th of November 2006, sponsored by the Defence College of Management and Technology. The speaker is Mr. David Snowden, who is the founder and Chief Scientific Officer of Cognitive Edge Pty Limited. Mr. David Snowden.
The last time I was in this actual room, I was sat there as part of a panel. And I think my views on knowledge management at that time were considered heretical, because I dared to challenge the concept that the Narcos-Secchi model, the tacit to explicit, had any value. My argument then and now was that it was the worst thing that could ever happen to knowledge management. I think now kind of like more people have started to agree with that point of view, but I want to continue and develop that, but assume that this will be controversial. I just want to sort of reprise where we are on this subject. And really this comes from an article I wrote called Complex Acts of Knowing, and there are articles on all of this sort of stuff on the website. Now, I regretted afterwards saying that there were 3 generations of knowledge management. This is kind of like a mistake you make from time to time. I discovered Larry Prusak, who I then worked for, just to publish an article on the 2nd generation of knowledge management, so there was a contradiction there from day one. And then somebody wrote to me to say that they were on the 5th generation of knowledge management, and why didn't I catch up? And I realised the error of my ways, but being as it's in the article, I'll hold to it for the moment. The period where I first got into this was in designing decision support systems back in the 80s. Now, people kind of like forget this, but that was the point of time where computers became scalable. Although in the 80s we were building corporate consolidation systems, converting telex input into digital form, stacking it into mainframes, and we thought we were highly progressive because we could produce a company's accounts in 5 days, as opposed to the 5 months it took historically on capture. And it was still the days where computers required anti-static maths, and you had to sing quietly to the tape machine, otherwise it wouldn't load the tape properly. But we were starting to realise that you could do a huge amount with information consolidation. And that really generated and reached its peak in data warehousing, and the concepts of central information repositories. Now, with regret, that concept of centralisation, which was about the only thing the technology could handle in terms of data integrity, is still hanging on in today's age where you can handle data integrity within a distributed environment. Right? But that sort of period is still informative, it's there. What happens in the mid-90s is people start to worry about this thing called knowledge. To use a J.C. Spender concept, knowledge becomes a problematic term. Nobody's even worried about the word before, it's only worried about by philosophers, but now it starts to come into currency. And part of the resilience of knowledge management is actually it had multiple origins. If you look at all the other management fads, business process re-engineering, learning organisation, Six Sigma, good to be great, I could carry on with a huge list. Each of them is linked with a single author and a single academic and a single approach. Knowledge management is about the only one which came from multiple, partially compatible, partially contradictory sources. You have Prusak and Davenport coming from information management, you have Petras with intellectual property management, you have the launch of Lotus Notes, which really defined knowledge management for about 5 years as a collaborative environment. You've got Leif Edvindson, Tom Stewart with intellectual capital measurement, and then you've got Nanaka with the book which was intended just to be an assessment of innovation in Japanese industry, which then created this model, tacit to tacit, tacit to explicit, explicit to explicit, the model that launched 1,000 failed knowledge management initiatives. Because what it focused people on is making tacit knowledge explicit. And whatever people said from the mid-90s right the way through really until last year, the most significant investment was still going into that particular approach. Now, I and others are now arguing that knowledge management as a movement or language is actually probably at the end of its life cycle. It's actually lasted over 10 years, that's unusual. You now see the sure and certain signs of the end. One is academics are now writing about it. And the other is that government is adopting it as industrial best practice, right? Now, these are, if you actually look at the history of most management movements, those are sure and certain indicators. And I've never understood why government ever adopts industrial best practice. For 2 reasons. First of all, they adopt things towards the end of the life cycle when industry have realised they don't really work, but consultants can create a lucrative secondary market on their case studies into government. The other is that government is a radically different environment from industry. Yeah, industry works on the basis of mass failure as a focus on market efficiency, whereas government has a responsibility for service. Yeah, but that's a sort of pet subject, and I'm not here to lecture about that, but it's come like that. What we're now into is a different period. A lot of people are picking up on Web 2.0, blogs and wikis. We've really had a massive swing of the pendulum from taxonomic, highly explicit structures into almost an anarchy of Web 2.0. Now, I'm going to talk later about the work we're doing with Singapore and elsewhere, which is a semi-structured tagging approach, which basically says the two extremes of rigid taxonomies and total freedom of tagging are both in error. We need something which is able to talk to and integrate the pair. But really, if you look at what's happening now in this period, you've got the sort of technology basis, which is all about social computing, and that's picking up from communities of practice and collaboration. You've also got the area that myself, Gary Klein, and some of you may know his work on decision theory, extensively used in military. But he and I are actually working together at the moment on a couple of papers and some actual research, which is starting to be known as sense-making. In fact, my appointment to the government of Singapore, the Ministry of Defence, is advisor on sense-making. And basically, sense-making, the working definition, is how do we make sense of the world so that we can act in it. And many of you will remember that the better definitions of knowledge management were concerned with action in the first place. So we're talking about sense-making as a capacity to act. Now, I also here want to contrast a naturalising approach to sense-making with other management approaches. And here, this is a difference between an idealistic approach and a naturalising approach. This is a quote from a book chapter that I've just written, which isn't going to be published till next year, but the chapter's available on the website. It looks at networks and narrative. And basically, in the idealistic approach, which has dominated management and government thinking for about 100 years or so, the assumption is you can define an ideal future. You can identify the current state, and you close the gap between the two. You see this in systems design as well. What's an ideal sort of system to have? How should people actually behave? We then design that system, and then we use cultural change or organisational change initiatives to try and conform people's behaviour with the system itself. Naturalising approaches, which have been around in philosophy for about 50 or 60 years now, but are now coming into management, really based on three factors. One is a rerouting of theory into the physical sciences. Yeah, that hasn't been done since Taylor brought the ideas of Newtonian physics into management. Yeah, so it's well overdue for a refresh. The other is to understand the way that human beings have actually evolved. And over 98% of our genetic history has been as clearly as seen hunter-gatherers. Yet we've only had 100 years of mass literacy and any concept of explicit information processing. And our genetic history doesn't bias us towards processing information. It biases us towards processing patterns. So the naturalistic approach says, how do human beings actually naturally do things? How do we structure that and scale it, rather than trying to close the gap? And the third difference is summarised in this statement. Naturalising sense-making is about gathering a sufficiency of information to make a decision, or to actually focus. So I'll expand this and talk through the science in a minute and give you some illustrations. And I want to do a little test. You really need a larger number of people to do this properly. Anybody read Wisdom of Crowds yet? Okay, well, Wisdom of Crowds is kind of like one of the better pop science books. If you want an example of a weak one, take Gladwell's Blink. You know, his first one, The Tipping Point, was quite good, but Blink picks up on some theory that doesn't really apply it. Wisdom of Crowds argues that large numbers of people making decisions on small aspects of a bigger decision will generally come up with better solutions than a committee of experts. It's key that nobody knows the entire result, which is why prediction markets don't work the same way. But basically, if you divide a complex problem up into lots of little problems, which can be answered by yes-no questions or scalar answers, and you distribute that problem to a large enough number of people, then the result you get has more accuracy in general than a committee of experts reviewing the problem. We're actually building software for the Singapore anti-terrorist system based on this principle, which will allow particularly difficult issues to be distributed across multiple agencies without any agency really knowing what question is being asked and the results being summarised or presented graphically. Yeah, so with distributed environments, there's an awful lot we can do to augment decision making. Now, in order to test this, I say we're a small group, And if you've ever seen this video before, then you're to shut up because you know what the correct answer is. I want to give us a little exercise in concentration. Now, if you look at this, has anybody seen this before? Oh, good. Right. There are two types of students. Some are wearing white and some are wearing black. Everybody got that? Now, what they're going to do when I set the video is they're going to pass a basketball between themselves. Now, for the pedants amongst you, and I have had arguments about this before, in fact, one military group in Singapore almost came to fisticuffs over it. Yeah, if you bounce the ball and catch it, that's one pass. So bounce and catch is one, throw and catch is one. To make it more complicated, there are two balls in play. But what I want you to do is to count the number of times the people in white pass the basketball. Everybody got that? All right, the number of times the people in white pass the basketball. And you really will have to concentrate for this. Okay, do you want to shout out some numbers?
14 balls. 14. 11. 20. 10. 15. 13.
Anybody notice anything unusual? How many people saw the gorilla? Right, let me show it you again. Now watch the whole picture. You see? Right, a lot of people use this to illustrate the fact that you should increase your capability for scanning. If you look at this from a cognitive science point of view, you've got two choices. You can count the balls or you can look for the gorilla. You can't do both simultaneously. And of course, if you're counting the balls, you don't see the gorilla. Now, technically, this is called the problem of weak signal detection. That gorilla is a bloody strong signal. In fact, if anybody's listening to the recording of this, my website actually has this video on it, so you can download it and look at it. But basically, I've tried this out with multiple audiences around the world. It's very rare for anybody to see the gorilla, unless they come in late or they're not really concentrating or they know this sort of game, so they know not to do the task and look for other things. All right? Depends how many management courses you've been on. Now, this relates to something very fundamental about human perception. And basically, I'm going to make a statement now which undermines nearly all current economic theory, behavioural theory of the firm, and traditional decision support theory. Human beings evolved to process patterns, not to process information. The only human beings who process information and make rational decisions based on a careful assessment of the available data, which is what economic theory says they do, turn out to be autistic. And the reason they can't actually cope is they are processing all data and they are making rational decisions. I recently bought 400 copies of a book called The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night Time, if anybody's read that, and gave it to the IT department of a large American company. Well, I got them to pay for it as well. And when I turned up to run a seminar for them, they said, it was a great book, why did we have to read it? And I said, you assume that your users are like the kid in that book. You assume they're going to process all information that you put in front of them on the screens, and they're going to make rational decisions. So 3 basic facts about the human brain. We've learnt more about the brain in the last 4 or 5 years than we've ever known before. First of all, you only ever see 0.01% of your visual range in sharp focus at any one time. You see the world as a series of spots, and you join in the dots from previous experience, which is why you don't see the gorilla. You actually don't even see the ball. Once you've got a couple of spots, you know it's a ball. Yeah, so that's all your brain is actually scanning. If you grew up in an English language environment, or German or French, or any grammatically structured language group, if you really, really focus and concentrate, you'll pick up 5% of the data that you scan. If you came up from a pictorial language group like Chinese or Japanese, it goes up to 10%. The differences in language have been around long enough to influence the evolution of the brain. Yeah, but 5% is the most for most of us in this room. The way your brain then makes a decision is to run what it perceives through patterns stored on its long-term memory, and it satisfies, not optimizes, either first pattern it finds it will apply. So to take an illustration from the first research on this, a radiologist has something like 40,000 patterns imprinted on their long-term memory, which are associated with their skill of being a radiologist, and they're roughly sequenced in frequency of use. So the radiologist looks at the X-ray, scans 3 to 4% of the data, does a first fit pattern match with their previous experience and applies it. If you're asked why you made a decision, you never actually state how you did it, you state how you think it's respectable to make it. So these days we explain a decision as a rational decision based on a careful assessment of available information. 3,000 years ago, tree spirits told us to do things. Both statements have the same reaction with reality, i.e. zero. Yeah? The pattern basis of human decision making is critical to understanding knowledge management, because it's not a matter of feeding information and allowing us to process it. We'll actually process what we receive, which we only partially comprehend, against patterns of previous experience. And of course the patterns come from two sources. One is personal experience, the other is story or narrative. Narrative is actually more important than personal experience, interestingly, in terms of patterns, because the human race is the only group of animals who've ever learned how to store knowledge in the external environment. And for 98% of our brain's evolutionary history, that's been stories. The work that Gary Klein and I did in Singapore showed that narrative-based assessment of a battlefield increased weak signal detection by 70% over analytical, structured assessment. Yeah, this is work that will be published next year. And it's logical if you think about it. The human brain has had millions of years evolving to handle narrative and very little time evolving to handle highly structured environments. So that's the fundamental science I want to link to. Number one is cognitive, the way that human beings make decisions. And that has major implications for the way we manage organisations, the way we do decision theory in practice, and virtually every other field. And sorry, the other thing I didn't tell you is that the majority of the experiences and narrative which are important are negative, not positive. So when my son, Hugh, burnt his finger on a match, I trusted him in a room with mud fire. 20,000 experiences of best practice didn't equate to one experience of worst practice in terms of pattern entrainment. And secondly, what stories spread fastest around any organisation? Bad ones. The human race has evolved to be a malicious bunch of gossips. A side effect of this has been to create a ready market for Australian media moguls, but fundamentally it's because avoidance of failure is a more successful strategy in evolutionary terms than imitation of success. So if you're trying to install a best practice system, which was a large part of knowledge management, you're fighting millennia of evolution which says it's a bad idea. Worst practice systems have more attention paid to them than best practice systems, and they're also easier and cheaper to set up. And if you look at the story traditions of the world, every single culture has developed a mechanism to share failure without attribution of blame through various genre forms of story. Right? So we can actually start to build on that. Hopefully you now see a naturalising approach starting to come through. This is the way human beings are, so let's not try and make human beings work like computers, which is where behavioural psychology and a whole bunch of other things have gone. They've taken a computer model of information processing because it's neat and tidy and attractive, and assumed that human beings do the same thing. My daughter's A-level psychology book states it is assumption that human beings are limited capacity information processing devices. And we forget that that's been orthodoxy in decision theory for about 40 or 50 years now, and it's fundamentally and basically flawed. So I've talked about pattern-based decision. The second thing, and this is one of the sort of rules of knowledge management I formulated many years ago, we always know more than we can tell, we will always tell more than we can write down. That is basic common sense. The process of going from my brain to my mouth to my hands involves an inevitable loss of content and principally a loss of context. Modern approaches to knowledge management no longer talk about tacit and explicit, because that language confuses the container with the thing contained, and also makes this separation between things which are written down and things which are in people's heads, which is a false dichotomy. Yet modern knowledge management looks at it through three perspectives, not categories, which are the knowledge which can only be gained through experience, knowledge which can be communicated in narrative form, and knowledge which can actually be written down. Now, written knowledge is very valuable because its diffusion capacity is high. The trouble is its cost is also high. I have a book coming out next year. It's taken me 3 years to write it, and it's not finished yet. I can teach it in 3 days. And that's actually the sort of ratio between verbal knowledge and written knowledge. And to assume that people can just type things into a computer or write things down after they've been through an experience, and that in any way captures the real knowledge, certainly to capture the knowledge in a communicative form, is actually basically false. The third, and this is where we come into some more heavy science, is that most human systems are complex adaptive systems. Now, anybody heard of complex adaptive systems theory? Right, well, so this is going to be equally disturbing as the pattern-based stuff. If you grew up in a Hindu or a Taoist environment, you don't have a problem with this because your religion and your philosophy has got a concept of a non-causal system. But in Western philosophy, we've forgotten about non-causal systems ever since the Enlightenment, because we've got all this wonderful advantage out of believing that there is a reason for things, to the point where there's a known problem in Western psychology called fundamental attribution error, by which human beings will always assign a reason for things even if there isn't one. What we now know from nature is that most organic systems, and that includes human social systems, are non-causal. With the benefit of hindsight, everybody can create a causal linkage, but there actually isn't a causal linkage in practice, because the next time things evolve, they could evolve in a completely different way. Now, the way this is often expressed is by talking about the problem of how do we join up the dots. Has anybody heard that phrase? It's very common in sort of royal commissions or any sort of commission of inquiry. After the event, with the benefit of hindsight, everybody can look through a mass of material and see how certain things should have been communicated to certain other people in a nice logical sequence. They can join up the dots. So because it's called retrospective coherence in complexity, because with retrospective coherence they can account for the past in causal chains, they assume that they can also do the same thing for the future. Now, one of the ways that I summarize this is to say hindsight doesn't lead to foresight. The fact I can understand the past doesn't mean that the past is going to repeat. I can learn from the past, and I'll talk later about a battlefield knowledge management system we're about to build, which basically uses fragmented knowledge from the past rather than structured knowledge from the past. But I can't assume that the past will repeat. My favourite example of this is the Congressional Report on 9/11. I don't know whether anybody's read it, but it's an absolute fascinating book. You can download it for free or buy it for £10 in the local bookshop, all right? It's down to your conscience which you do. If you buy it from the bookshop, you'll save £150 of whatever your laser printer cartridge costs are on printing it off locally, all right? So I'll leave it to your conscience. The first few chapters are ideological. They establish the good guys were very, very good and the bad guys were very, very bad, because there's a genre of Western fiction they have to play into to get attention. But then you get this huge body of retrospective coherence with the benefit of 2.5 years of hindsight. Everybody can say how everybody should have made the connections, and the basic fundamental argument is the failure of 9/11 was a failure of knowledge management. We didn't join up the dots. Okay, next little problem for you. If I have 4 dots, I have 6 linkages between the dots, which means there are multiple patterns that can form from the dots. So with 4 dots, there are 64 possible patterns. I'll show you the formula in a minute. If I go up to 10 dots, how many patterns are there? It's ritual humiliation time. You know you're going to get it wrong. Let's just get on with it, all right? Have a guess. Formula or phrases like lots are not permitted. Anyone want to guess? 1,000?
Probably about 1 million.
About 1 million.
I guess.
About 1 million? How many people think it's about 1 million there or thereabouts? You think it's substantially more? Billion? 3.5 trillion. There's a very old Chinese folk tale of a sage asked for a reward by the Chinese emperor, who said, I'll have 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard. And they ended up owning the entire rice crop of China. With the benefit of hindsight, anybody can see a pattern in a historical event. But the sheer number of dots and the sheer number of possible patterns mean that we can't manage the future in the same way. Right? Now, my favourite illustration of this is to look at how we could manage a children's party. Now, I want to take here the 3 basic schools of management thinking, all right? And you may not know these, but there's kind of like, there's the techno-fabulist, I must be academically respectable. Right? The techno-fabulist approach which says that everything is a process, everything can be measured, all outcomes can be determined in advance. If you can't say how your results should be measured in 2 years' time and commit to those targets, then you're a failure. Everybody familiar with this approach? It goes with business process re-engineering. And the latest manifestation of that is Six Sigma. Anybody heard of that one? Yeah, business process re-engineering with the worst aspects of American Bible Belt cultism added in for good measure. Right? So that's the sort of techno-fetishist, techno-fabulist end of the spectrum. At the other end, we have the art Luddite, otherwise known as the New Age fluffy bunny approach to management, under which this is also postmodernism, all right? There's no coherence, everything is ideological, everything is unstructured. It's all about powerful people doing things to unpowerful people whose phrases have to be explained by academics who deconstruct the ideology. Sorry, I could go down a rat hole on this one. So kind of like we got this, there is no order or structure, there's absolute order or structure. And then we got sort of sense-making, which is sort of coming in between the two. So let's look at how all three schools of thought would manage a party for a bunch of, say, 10 or 12-year-olds. Right? Everybody can imagine this? The art Luddite approach involves buying the drugs and alcohol so the children go on a personal experience of self-discovery and not having any boundaries or controls because they will self-organise into some sort of structure over time. I don't recommend that, but I have got some friends on the west coast of the States who've actually tried it, and I live in Wiltshire next to Avebury, so we do have a slight New Age environment there. So you see the evidence of the outcome of that approach every now and then, particularly around solstice time. On the other hand, the techno-fabulist approach is one that you'll all be familiar with. Under this, you agree learning objectives for the party in advance of the party itself. You make sure that the learning objectives are aligned with the mission statement for education in the region to which you belong. You produce a project plan for the party. The project plan should have a set of clear milestones throughout the party against which you can measure progress against ideal party outcome. And the senior adult should use PowerPoint at the start of the party to demonstrate their personal commitment to the party and also to demonstrate to the children how pocket money is linked to the achievement of the milestone targets. Following the successful completion of the party, you conduct an after-action review, update your best practice database on party management and mandate future process improvements. And if for any reason the children are in any way unhappy, you hire an appreciative inquiry practitioner who will make damn sure they tell happy stories and have happy mental models so next time they enjoy the party regardless. Right? Now that, I assume, because you've all been properly trained, is the way you would manage a party. The naturalising approach, on the other hand, is very different, yeah?
You've got the risk management.
I'll work that one in, actually. There is, if you want that one, on the website, this guy who works at the Monterey Institute recently reworked the children's party story into a Socratic dialogue. Yeah, about trying, and the lovely phrase in it, the children failed to show respect for the devotional sacrifices, but it's on the website. I strongly recommend it. It's entirely expressed in American military terms, all right, and it's a great reworking. Right? So I strongly recommend it. Either way, the naturalising approach is very different. We draw a line in the sand. This is called a boundary and complexity theory. And we say, cross that and you die. And one of the things you learn pretty fast as an adult is the value of flexible, negotiable boundaries, because rigid boundaries have a habit of breaking very quickly. We then use catalysts to create attractor mechanisms, football, videotape, barbecue, computer game, in the hope that a beneficial pattern or identity of child play will form around the catalyst. Yeah, so what we're actually doing, and if it's a good pattern, we allow it, we reinforce it. If it's a bad pattern, we disrupt it quickly. So what we're actually doing is we're managing the emergence of identity around attractors within boundaries. And we can't know what the outcome is until after the party is over in other than platitudinous terms. But once the party is over, with the benefit of hindsight, we can attribute cause and effect relationships, but we can't guarantee repetition in the future. Now, this is of major importance for government. The Economist Intelligence Unit has identified the major challenge for government over the next 10 to 15 years is to do far more with far less. Very significant. Also for industry, to be honest. If we carry on managing government in the way that I satirise for a children's party, you spend a lot more money to make things worse. Whereas managing barriers, attractors and identities means you spend very little money, but you still control the emergence of stable, beneficial patterns. If you want the best example of this around at the moment, it's the Grameen Bank, which recently won a Nobel Prize, regrettably not for economics, but the Peace Prize. And basically that's a banking system in Bangladesh where instead of relying on credit scoring, that's the techno-fabulist approach, which costs you a lot of money, any person in a village can take out a loan of up to a certain sum of money, provided 5 other members of the same village take out the same size loan at the same time, and they all guarantee each other's debts. 15 years on, they have a 98.5% debt repayment record and a zero cost of lending, which any Western bank would die for. Now, one of the methods we developed within Cognitive Edge, and we run an open source approach to method development. Methods can be downloaded for free from the website. Yeah, we're part of that sort of open source site. It's called social network stimulation, and it's designed in honour to the Grameen Bank. If you can stimulate the linking or connecting of people based on a self-selected, trusted basis, and if you can get everybody within 2 to 3 degrees of separation of everybody else based on such a relationship, and that can be done without too much difficulty in 2 years, based on, structured project work, then you don't need to worry about 80% of knowledge management anymore, because you've created a network capability to distribute knowledge and help people out, which is far more flexible than a structured IT-based system. That's called social network stimulation. Now let's just do a test on the group here. I'm going to give you 3 things, and I want you to tell me which is the odd one out. Everybody remember this from primary school? I've been expelled from 3 educational establishments in my life and reinstated in each case. In university, it took Her Majesty the Queen sitting in Privy Council, but that was more entertaining. And the first one was for explaining to a Welsh primary school teacher who grew up in a chapel that the bullock was not the male of a heifer, and then proceeding to explain what a bullock didn't have and what a heifer hadn't had done, which made that physically impossible. And that lost me my place in primary school for a week, but I was a vet's son and a farmer's grandson. But you'll all remember Ryder. Anybody remember Ryder's first aid in English? Anybody old enough for that? And you had all of these sort of things. This is the opposite of this. Which is the odd one out of this list? Okay. Right, so you're all used to this. I'm going to read them out twice. Then I want you to close your eyes. And I have taught in a primary school, so if anybody opens their eyes, they'll be in the corner of the room for the rest of the lecture. I want to make this very clear. And I'll go through them one by one, and I want you to hold up your hand. Okay, so the 3 things are cow, chicken, and grass. Okay? Cow, chicken, grass. Okay, close your eyes. Everybody. Thank you. Hands up if you think the cow is the odd one out. Hands up if you think chicken is the odd one out. Hands up if you think grass is the odd one out. Okay, you can open your eyes. 2/3 excluded grass, 1/3 excluded chicken. The good news is nobody got rid of the cow. That's the one way you detect the awkward bugger in the audience who wants to be different because they knows it's not rational, all right? It's a good workshop technique, this one. You followed the Northern European English North American norm, in which 2/3 will exclude grass because it's a vegetable and the other 2 are animals, because you grew up in an Aristotelian tradition of categorization and you want to put things in boxes. The Asian, Southern European, African, Celtic norm, we have to make sure that you realise the Welsh are different from the English, just in case you didn't realise it, and technically we are still on Welsh territory here, all right, based on the last negotiated peace settlement with the Saxons, but we won't go back to that period. Basically, in those groups, 2/3 would exclude the chicken because the cow's got a relationship with the grass and they think in terms of relationships, not categories. Now, around that divide, more bloodshed has been lost in religious and political wars than anything else because it's the primacy of the individual against community issue. But it's also fundamental to knowledge management about whether you structure or build systems based on relationships, and nodal networks are a particularly solid form of self-organizing capability, or whether you build it based on categories. And the thing about categories is they're neat and tidy. They focus on what's called exploitation, whereas relationships are messy, but they're more effective at exploration. Now, I'm not going to privilege one or the other, but I am going to argue that one should not be privileged over the other. Both actually need to come into play. And that links in with the Grameen Bank and the other sort of examples I've talked about there. Once we start to understand this, we need to, and I'm really going to go through 2 things, and both of them fairly quickly because there are articles which back this up. One is we need to approach what's called take a multi-ontology based approach to sense making or decision making. Once we understand that some systems are complex, like the Children's Party, whereas other systems are not complex, like, for example, a bank's payment system, which can be rigidly process re-engineered, we need to start to realize that the nature of the relationship between cause and effect determines different and seemingly incompatible analytical and decision theories. Now, this model is at the heart of the anti-terrorist system we're building for Singapore. It basically says you can't afford to have a single technology-based system. You need to have systems which operate in at least 4 domains. So I'm going to run through this quickly to explain it. And the key distinction here is between systems which are ordered, that's not the Children's Party, and systems which are unordered, that is the Children's Party. So in an ordered system, there are repeating relationships between cause and effect. Not only are they repeatable, but I can know what they are, and I can use them to predict or mandate future actions. In an unordered system, there are no repeating relationships between cause and effect, so I can't use hindsight to produce foresight. I have to develop different tools and technologies. In the Singapore system, another institution is handling the systems for ordered systems. That's things like scenario planning, entity analysis, intent type measures. On the left-hand side, that's where we're building systems for the highly uncertain dynamics of actually an anti-terrorist position. So, we have 4 types of area. We have simple relationships between cause and effect, simple order, in which everybody can see what the relationships are, therefore there is no excuse for not making the right decision. And we all know, don't we, that civilized countries drive on the left-hand side of the road? So if you drive on the right-hand side of the road in a civilized country, you can expect everything that comes to you. Yeah, and vice versa. We have simple order, the relationship between cause and effect is self-evident. Yeah, therefore, we can sense, categorize, respond, which means we can apply best practice, because there is a right answer and the answer is evident to everybody. On the other hand, in a complicated environment, although the relationship between cause and effect exists, it's not self-evident. Therefore, we have to do some sort of analysis or rely on experts. So the decision model is sense, analyze, respond. And there we can apply good practice, but not best. Because actually different groups of expertise will have different approaches, all of which are valid. And the subtleties of when they are or not valid is probably only understood by the expert. It can't be understood by command authority. Therefore, permitting expert-validated options as opposed to a single form of best practice is a much more successful strategy. Now, most people operate between simple and complicated order, and the assumption is you can oscillate between the two. The reality is we now know there are a whole body of systems which are unordered, and unordered can be complex or it can be chaotic. There's a frequent confusion between chaos theory, complexity theory, and systems thinking. One of the sure ways of knowing whether somebody knows their subject or not is if they confuse those 3, then they're reading superficially. A complex system is a Children's Party. Identities are forming around attractors within barriers. You can sense or see patterns, you can reinforce the good ones, you can disrupt the bad ones. You can't determine the future, but you can influence its direction and you can see the patterns, and effectively we now talk about navigating complexity. I used to sail dinghies, fireballs. Yeah, fireball was a great thing. You should have got Olympic class. It was unfair it didn't, right? But you got to sense the patterns of waves, of wind on the waves. I don't think anybody could have described how you did it, but once you'd raced for 2 or 3 years, you kind of just knew. You couldn't control or determine exactly what would happen, but you had a sense of the possible patterns or the route that you could navigate. You knew some places you shouldn't go and some places you should go, but you couldn't know the exact outcome. So the model here is to probe, sense, respond. Remember the Children's Party? The football, the videotape, the barbecue are probes. They're designed to see what is possible. This is also called shifting from a fail-safe to a safe-fail decision policy. On the right-hand side, you can have a fail-safe strategy because there is a right answer. On the left-hand side, you know that you need to have multiple failures in order to understand what's possible. So the secret is to shift to a safe-fail environment in which you actually deliberately target people on partial controllable failure because only the failure will teach you what possibilities open up. Now, interestingly, the head of the civil service in Singapore recently published an article where he actually argued very strongly that government needs to move from fail-safe to safe-fail policy, because fail-safe policy is produced in highly static systems which have no capability of evolution, whereas safe-fail is a controlled failure which increases your capability of managing the future. And of course, in a chaotic system, you haven't got time for probes, you act, sense, respond. Now you'll notice that sense, respond are tightly coupled in unorder and separated in order. The reason is, in an ordered environment with repeating relationships between cause and effect, not only is there a right answer, but diagnostic and intervention can be separated. On the other hand, in an unordered system, every diagnostic actually changes the system. And therefore, every diagnostic should be constructed on the basis that it's an intervention, and every intervention should be constructed on the basis it's a diagnostic. My favourite way of illustrating this is the complexly complicated domain, is think about an aircraft. I can take an aircraft apart and put it back together again, and it's unchanged. Well, I can't, but people who know what they're doing can. On the other hand, if I go into an organisation as a consultant, even the rumour of my coming in changes the organisation. So it never stays static throughout the diagnostic period. In fact, the diagnostic changes the nature of the social interactions. One of the ways we often illustrate this overseas is to show a picture of the magic roundabout. I have a habit of bringing Australians and Americans and getting them to drive through that without giving them notice, because they don't have a concept of a roundabout, so the magic roundabout is particularly scary. And the fact that Swindon Borough Council, it's a major tourist attraction if you look on the website, and you can download pictures of it, yeah? But it's an example of a complex management system. If you remember, for a long period of time, they just moved barriers around until they saw what pattern would optimize traffic flow. Whereas if you put traffic lights on every entry, that would be a complicated system. And that's what they do in the States. Traffic lights controlling every entry and exit in hugely sophisticated computer systems. What the magic roundabout does, which is a highly successful experiment in traffic management, it has barriers and it has tractors, and it's largely self-organizes or self-managed, but it was constructed by multiple experiments over quite a few years in terms of the way it was built. Now, this basic model is designed to argue that having systems based entirely on the top right-hand side, which is where most people design knowledge management systems, or the bottom right, even worse, is good within boundaries, but flawed if you take it universally. Approaches on the left are radically different. And of course, with that go different organisational models. In a simple environment, you can afford to have a controlling hierarchy. In a complicated environment, and you all know these, all the experts have to buy in before anything can happen. So they're highly static environments. In fact, expert communities tend to be the least innovative in any organisation, because the pattern experience that they've built, the patterns through which they filter data, are so well developed, if something completely novel happens, they won't see it. Yeah? And if you look at the history of science, it's mavericks and accidents, it's never structured process. On the other hand, in a complex environment, the centre, like the parent at the party, can't afford to dive down into the detail. They have to watch and monitor the patterns and see what happens. And in a chaotic environment, there are no connections between anything else. So the issue is, do you shift it into simple, impose central control? Or do you shift it into complex, increase network connectivity, so that possible patterns of revolution will solve themselves? Now, interestingly, this is described in an article called New Dynamics of Strategy on the website by Kurtz and myself. Shifting a problem into a complex environment produces higher resilience than shifting it into a simple environment. But most people only think of the shift into simple in a crisis, which actually creates the conditions for a reversal into chaos downstream. And the reason this boundary is shown here is that actually it's just when you think you really understand things that you're at most risk of falling over into chaos. If you look at the history of large corporations, it's just when you think they're at the top. Think about IBM's near bankruptcy, think about Enron, I could carry on. Everybody is saying how wonderful they are the day before they enter catastrophic failure. In fact, there are two sure and certain indicators of company failure. One is they start to believe they're right, and the other is they build a glossy new corporate headquarters. Both seem to be indicators of that. That kind of leads me to a reminder. One of the reasons we do KM is very simple. A lot of people have got obsessed with doing knowledge management for the sake of managing information. Knowledge management, to my mind, has two basic purposes. The first of all, which is very, very simple, is to improve decision making. Now that involves multi-ontology approaches. It also recognises the reality of the way that people make decisions, which is based on patterns. So why do you think that military people go on through so many exercises with so many training courses? It's to increase the number of patterns on their long-term memory. It's why a lot of things can't be done until you've done them for 2 or 3 years, because that's the time it takes the brain to structure the synaptic patterns in which you can work. We also know that human consciousness is distributed in its chemical system as well as its electrical system. Some things your fingers have to learn how to do. I probably shouldn't mention rugby, given national grief on this side of the border at the moment, and it's probably dangerous given who we're playing on Saturday. All right? But fundamentally, you can see, a young player comes on, even though they're naturally talented, it's several years before they build enough patterns on their memory that they can really handle very rapid decision making under conditions of uncertainty. Now, interestingly, it's linked with a system we're currently about to build in Singapore. He's probably one of the most successful commanders of the Second World War was General Patton. He was also, in terms of moving forward at pace, he was almost unsurpassed. He was also one of the greatest military historians of his age. And the argument from a cognitive science point of view is he had multiple fragments of many, many different battles stored on his long-term memory. In fact, he was obsessed with military history. So moving forward under fire, he is blending different fragments from multiple battles over history. So his brain is able to make decisions rapidly and quickly because the basic patterns are there, but they're held in fragmented form, not best practice form. There are other aspects to this. We know that, for example, by the time you're 2 or 3, your brain has worked out whether you can ever be a fighter pilot, because it's a period of plasticity on the human brain. It haven't had the right experiences. They can't redevelop after that except at tremendous cognitive overload. So basically, developing or structuring the patterns, either in a virtual environment or a physical environment, is key. Let's briefly mention innovation. Innovation is one of the other functions of knowledge management, which is to create new knowledge. Now, just to say something very controversial that I'll defend later if you want, creativity is nothing whatsoever to do with innovation. This is a classic techno-fabulous confusion of the symptoms of something with the causes of something. Creativity is an emergent property, a symptom of innovative capacity. It's not a causal factor. Now, you see the same with trust. Trust is a phenomenon of knowledge exchange. It doesn't create knowledge exchange in the first place. If you look at human history, there are 3 necessary but not sufficient conditions for innovation. There's starvation, pressure, and perspective shift. And the reason is, anybody seen the film Apollo 13? You know that scene where they put the scientists in the room and say, that's all you've got? Starvation, of resources, pressure of time, perspective shift, people we know are going to die. Why do you think there's more innovation during wartime? It's actually not because there's more resource, often there's less. It's because all of the old patterns on your long-term memory can't sustain themselves anymore. So you're open to create new patterns. Which is why resourcing people or making people comfortable if you want them to innovate is a mistake, because you don't disrupt the patterns on their long-term memory so they carry on making the same sort of decisions. Think about longitude. Do you remember who knows the story of longitude? 20 years the scientific community ignored the solution because it wasn't a pattern of solution that they expected. And that is repeated time and time again in science. There's an old military doctrine. It takes 2 years of war for the peacetime generals to die out and for the wartime generals to come through. It's all about what patterns exist on your memory and the way you actually work. One of the most fundamental ways in which we make sense of the world is narrative. So I want to finish off just by giving some illustrations of this. I mean, this is a 2 to 3 day course in its own right, to be honest. Take it properly. You should never ever confuse narrative with storytelling. Right? Storytelling has a common language use in English, which is about lying. And we quite like hearing stories for the purpose of entertainment, but the idea that you can send somebody on a 1 or 2 day course in storytelling and they can come back and be a more effective communicator is basically snake oil salesman. It's 10 years before an Irish Tanaki is allowed to tell their first story. That's a traditional storyteller. It's about the same time to become a competent scriptwriter or a journalist. You can't be trained in this in 1 or 2 days. But we all know how to use narrative. Narrative is far more significant as a way of disclosing meaning than it is as a way of communicating. The stories that people tell on internet chat lines, around water coolers, in social settings are far more significant to understand their motivation than anything they do in response to a structured question. To give you an example of that, a classic one is, do you think this company is a good place to work in? Answer on a scale of 1 to 5. Well, you all know what the right answer is meant to be, so you either give the high answer or the low answer, depending on your mood that day, or you do what I did in IBM and write back, it depends on the context. Does your manager consult you on a regular basis? Which manager? Because basically those are context free. An equivalent in narrative capture is, imagine you're having a drink on a Friday night, your best friend comes in and says they've been offered a job in your organisation. What stories from your or your friend's experience would you tell them if you wanted them to join? And what stories from your or your friend's experience would you tell them if you didn't want them to join? See the difference between a narrative inquiry and a hypothesis-based inquiry? You make no assumptions about the causal factors in the question you asked. Now, let's kind of pull this together. I want to take two examples here. One is the Museum of Liverpool, the other is RAS, and then a final one about Battlefield Command, and it will make the point. I'm going up to work on this week. We've been doing a project for the Museums of Liverpool for about a year now. And what they're doing is they're trying to measure the impact of the museum on the children of Liverpool. Now, a questionnaire is meaningless because the children are influenced by the teachers. They only get the results every 6 months, and then they look at the results and say children of dissatisfaction with staff performance has increased by 5%. Why? Nobody knows. They commission more consultants to do more reports to try and find out why they get nowhere. What now happens in Liverpool is every time a child visits a museum, when they go back to their school, they use the same software we've developed for Singapore for anti-terrorism to actually write a story about their museum visit, and they tag it across multiple tags. So one of the tags relates to staff performance. So the ideal is treat the children with respect. The two extremes are patronise them, try and be too much like them. So the children tag on that scale. We now have 3 consequences. About 5 of those tags, 18 multi-choice questions. It's kind of like ungameable. The museum director now has a screen in which you can see the shift in the way that people are indexing their stories. So if she gets a small shift towards negative staff behaviour, she can look directly at the stories which created that shift. So you have numbers carrying with them the context to understand the numbers. By the end of this year, we'll have 250,000 stories in the database, all indexed by the pupils who created them, which means we have an unassailable statistic result to report to government, and we can also feed government figures supported by stories from the children, which is exactly what politicians want. We're now doing the first experiments on that in Singapore to measure educational added value for non-academic schools in poor areas of Singapore, because the stories that the local community tell them and the statistical significance of the indexing become key. In the anti-terrorist environment, this is even more important, because what we're interested in is not people looking at the data, because then you get pattern entrainment. And what happens is if an analyst looks at 2 or 3 items, they form a hypothesis in their brain, and their brain then only sees the things which can form that hypothesis in the subsequent data they look at. They don't see the gorillas. In the Singapore system, analysts tag data as it comes in, or it's semi-automated in tagging, and then they look for patterns in the tags. They don't look at the raw data. Which means when you see a pattern in the tag, an anomaly or a cluster, then you pay attention to the data in a way that you wouldn't if you were doing a traditional analyst-type process. And kind of like final slide now. If I then look at this in terms of battlefield lessons learned, and you can have a copy of the slides and there's more examples here. Come back to my pattern example. What we're doing with a couple of staff colleges, Singapore and one other country, and we're open to more collaboration on this, is when students go through command courses, they have to study battlefields. So they break the battlefield up into little sketch plans, different perspectives from different people, historical records. They actually tag each of those historical records. And then you have a system which kind of like almost replicates Patton's brain, but hopefully not his politics. And the way you actually ask an in question, and this is kind of like the basic point I want to leave you with, is you focus on serendipitous encounter, not taxonomic structure. Because the human brain is designed for serendipity. The way we like to know something is to encounter multiple anecdotes from different sources, blend them together with our own context to come up with new knowledge. We do not want to be presented with actual sanitized material. US Army Lessons Learned project, brilliant on capture, hopeless on presentation. Because they captured raw anecdotal material, but then they synthesized it into doctrine and presented it back as complete stories, as a result of which very few people pay attention. So a classic query, and this is for one we did with Australian farm workers looking at suicides. Yeah, final story. You may not know this, but the most common method of suicide amongst Australian farm workers is to put a shotgun in your mouth and pull the trigger. Right? This is not recommended. Yeah, it's not recommended if you want to kill yourself because it's only 70% effective. 30% of the time you'll end up in hospital, and the rest of your life you'll have plastic across your cheek. I know one cricket club whose opening batsman went through this, and it intimidates the bowlers no end, all right? But fundamentally it's not recommended. The second most common method of suicide amongst Australian farm workers is to swallow a certain agrochemical, at which point you're going to die. It will take you 2 weeks, you'll drown in your own body fluids, it's an agonising death, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. So either way, first project we ever did on narrative was to examine this problem because the product had been banned in several countries. So we pulled in 30,000 stories from health workers, Australian farm workers in about a week. The most we've ever done, incidentally, is 95,000 in 48 hours from 4 continents at a cost of under $35,000. That was an intelligence project. Narrative is very cheap because it's self-interpreted. So we pulled in 30,000 stories. It was tagged by the people who created it, and 2 patterns came out of the tagging. One was the majority of the negative stories were coming from doctors, not eco-activists. Now that shocked the agrochemical company because they were only paying attention to the stories from their traditional enemy. The eco-activists, they hadn't realised that this time it was the doctors who were against them, and the doctors hated something they couldn't cure. So they actually switched their propaganda from a scientific argument to a more emotional one. Like, you can't take this stuff accidentally. It's got gagging chemicals in it. It stinks. It's in special bottles. You have to really want to swallow this. To swallow it, it can't happen accidentally. Doctors hadn't really realised that. That changed their attitude. But the query which solved it, and this is a classic query on the narrative database, so imagine this for a battlefield commander as well. Tell me all the stories told by a rational archetype around the theme our product kills people, told with high emotional intensity from the perspective of a first witness with the intention of attacking our company. That's 5 clicks of a mouse button. 18 stories appear on the screen. Imagine a battlefield. Yet a similarly ambiguous question produces fragments from 20 or 30 battlefields spread over history. You're replicating the way the human brain wants to work. Either way, one of the stories which came out of that shocked everybody. It was a story of a farmer whose brother had committed suicide swallowing the chemical. The farmer had made a video of his brother dying. Yeah, and it is a gruesome death. I've seen a mother die of lung cancer. This is worse. And basically took that, edited it down, and took it around Australian outback stations to show farm workers how horrible the death was so that they wouldn't commit suicide. And he acted like a typhoid Mary. Wherever he went, suicides went up, not down. Because it turns out suicides don't believe they'll suffer. And secondly, they quite fancy the idea of a 2-week death, which brings the whole family around the bed to regret the way they've been treated over the years. Basically, nobody had seen the gorilla because they were making assumptions about previous patterns. Either way, that got the chemical rehabilitated. The basic fundamental point I'm trying to drive here, which is fundamental to all of this, is very simple. It goes back to that video I showed at the start. If you take an analytical approach based on an assumption of repeating relationship between cause and effect and best practice, then you don't see the gorilla. Or if you look for the gorillas, you don't count the bulls. On the other hand, if you recognize that different systems require different approaches, and if you start to scientifically use the fundamental sense-making capability of human beings, which is narrative patterns, then you increase the possibility that you can both see the gorilla and count the bulls. And you certainly increase the knowledge generative capacity of the organization. And now with the new stuff coming out on impact analysis, you have the capability of producing statistically valid numbers which are ungameable in their outcome, but which fundamentally link back to narrative, so the numbers carry with them context. And to me, knowledge management as focused on decision theory now shifts from technology-based tacit to explicit conversion into technology-based augmentation of human decision in what is known as naturalising sense-making. Thank you very much for your time.
Mr. Snowden was asked the following 5 questions. Question 1. If the Grameen Bank is such a successful business, why don't other banks copy it?
There are actually now, if you look at it, there are now entrepreneurs using the Grameen Bank methods, and they are increasing the charge ratio, and they are actually making good money on it. But it's not the sort of returns that Western banks expect to get. Western banks, like Western companies, would prefer to sell to much smaller ranges of affluent customers. They have this concept of the bad customer. Now, this is another reason why I don't think you can take industrial as best practices across the government, because government can't decide that it's got good and bad citizens and exclude its bad citizens from its services. So the Grameen Bank has never been a charity. It took them 2 years before they ceased to require loans. After that, the system has been self-generating. It's replicated in Glasgow, it's replicated in Australia, it's replicated in several places in the States, it's currently being worked in South America. But the principle is self-organising capability with self-referential systems, because basically you know who you can trust in a village in a way that can never be written down or credit scored. Credit scoring assumes causality. It assumes that certain properties of a person determine their future behaviour. Yeah, and it doesn't work like that.
Question 2. If I know that you're using naturalising sense-making, how do I attack you from a pragmatic point of view?
It's very difficult, actually, because most of this stuff is common sense. I mean, one of the reasons we show the video and do the children's party is kind of like we all know this is the way it works, but we've learned to think differently. One of the things I say to people is just assume if it wouldn't work with your teenage children, assume it won't work with your employees. It's just you'll know it won't work pretty fast with the teenage children. With your employees, it will take years for you to discover it hasn't worked. Yeah? The basic attack you see from government, which I think is deeply depressing, is yes, but actually we're expected to do things this way. In fact, I'll show you, this is a famous quote from Cardinal Bellarmine, who is probably the best Jesuit theologian of his day. I'm sorry, I was in the Jesuits for a brief period. Wrote the definitive text which destroys Protestantism intellectually, didn't destroy it in practice, and was a friend of Galileo. And he tried to persuade Galileo to kind of like keep this stuff about the earth going around the sun for the purpose of mathematical calculation, but not to say it did it in reality. And that was Catholic doctrine for 150 years. With the benefit of hindsight, we say how stupid. But I would argue that the current focus on evidence-based policy and outcome-based measurement is exactly the same case. Everybody knows it's producing the opposite of what it's meant to do. Try and make an appointment with your doctor in less than 48 hours. Look at shipments of people out of accident and emergency wards. Everybody knows that, but nobody wants to say it because it would disrupt the status quo. So the principal attack comes from, please don't disturb things, they're under control. Now, if you want to take that position, feel free.
Question 3. If knowledge is measured by the amount of patterns or information included in the brain, and knowledge management is simply the intelligence or brain activity, does that mean that the whole concept of knowledge management is dependent on physiological facts of the capacity of the brain and the efficiency of brain activity? And is this determined at birth?
Right, well, that's a very big question, right? So let me answer it in various ways. First of all, I am by training a philosopher, so I'm not going to risk a definition of knowledge. One thing philosophy teaches you is not to try and define knowledge, because we've learned to disprove it in many ways, but I still like justified true belief, right? But let's come back to the issue on the cognitive capacity. Basically, yes, everybody is born with a certain basic cognition. There's a huge amount of evidence now that intelligence tests don't work, that they're severely culturally biased. In fact, the example I gave you of cow, chicken and grass comes from one of the basic challenges to intelligence tests, that they're culturally biased in terms of the way they assess intelligence. And a brain which has evolved from a society which works in a different way will think about the world differently. But let's look at the way the patterns come. First of all, I can't remember what the figure is, but the most human beings only use about 5 to 6% capacity anyway. All right, so actually in terms of raw processing capacity, there isn't a huge amount of difference. Yeah? But really, it's the experience you have which embeds the patterns. So if you, and this is why it actually becomes critical, if you look at human nurture, and we go through 2 periods where the brain goes through massive plasticity. One is 2 to 3 and the other is puberty. Now between 2 to 3, we forget things. So when you're born, you can hear and speak something like 850 sounds. Once you go through the terrible twos, and they are the terrible tools for this reason, yeah, just like teenage is terrible for a similar reason, basically you lose the capacity down to about 150 or 120, depending on the language group. because your brain is deciding what it needs for its life, and it's going to throw away superfluous functionality. So if sounds aren't heard or used, the neurons around them die off, and something else happens instead. Which is why if you can speak 3 languages at home, it makes sense, because kids can sort them out. I mean, my parents spoke 3 languages, but they were born in the period where it said it confused children if you spoke them in one house. So they thought I could learn them later on, which I can't. Yeah? So, basic mistake. Puberty, interestingly, the inhibition circuits disappear. And then they reform. So during those 2 key periods, the brain goes through massive change. It can change itself back, but it's much more difficult after that than it is during that period. So experiences you have up to about 2 or 3 are critical to develop cognitive capacity. That's the stuff on aircraft. And the wing commander may know this, but I got this from New Zealand Air Force, who've done research. Basically, the sort of experiences kids have up to about 2 or 3 determine whether they'll ever be able to fly a fighter pilot. Because basically it creates patterns on their brain which are associated with motors and everything else like that. We most have the capacity. Teenage is similar. It builds social inhibition into the system and therefore builds ethical, non-ethical behaviour. But fundamentally we use very little capacity, and as we gain more experience, more patterns print, and as we hear more stories, pattern print. Now, let me give an example. I'm in trouble for anti-American behaviour at the moment. So I've got to defend myself on this, because at the conference in the States I gave this example. If you look at the stories that we tell, stories determine ideology. So I went to university in Britain in the 70s. If we didn't occupy the university at least once a year, we didn't think we were real revolutionaries. And we very quickly learned how to distinguish, I can still do this, between 16 different types of Marxists based on 5 minutes conversation in a bar, because a not insignificant amount of time as a philosophy student is spent doing precisely that. Engineers had to work, we just had to talk. I can still do that. I now spend a lot of my time in Washington, where anything to the left of Tony Blair, which is not difficult to achieve, is considered a dangerous communist. And they can distinguish between 15 different varieties of the religious right, which to me is an amorphous mass which justifies the full reimposition of the Inquisition with all of its tools and instruments. Yeah? Now, there's no genetic difference. The difference is the entrained patterns that stories create on our brains, as a result of which, if you look at it, Democrats and Republicans are the opposite extremes of the Conservative Party in the UK context. They all got very upset at me in the States, all right? So I'm having to defend myself, but it's fundamental. Now let's look at that in the context of understanding an organisation or a society. Stories are fractal. They're self-similar. So there are stories in society, stories in your company, stories in your work group, stories in your peer group, which basically get triggered according to context. Human beings trigger different stories according to the context in which they sit, which means different patterns come to the forefront of their memory to determine their decision function. So if I want to understand terrorism, I need to map the stories, and I need to understand that I will never understand the stories as somebody who's in an alien culture. So a project we did 3 weeks after 9/11, which is still moderately confidential, we got flown back into Washington. We did the first DARPA project we completed the night before 9/11. I flew back that night, picked up the news the next day. Spent 2 weeks trying to find out if everybody was still alive, and then had to go back into Washington to run a project to get a group of American policymakers to see 9/11 from an Islamic perspective. Now, if anybody was in Washington immediately after 9/11, you know that seeing anything from any perspective other than American was kind of like dangerous, all right? The way we did it is we used the stories of American culture to create resonance, because you only understand something if it reflects a pattern which is already on your mind. So we used the War of 1812. We were actually looking at Afghanistan at the time. Now, in the War of 1812, which is the only time the Americans and the British have ever declared war on each other, we were the dominant, arrogant imperial power, and they were the small, upstart colony. We finally got irritated to the point where we sent an entire naval battle fleet and experienced troops in the Napoleonic Wars. We wiped out the entire American Atlantic Navy in one engagement, apart from the USS Constitution, which ran back into Boston Harbor and hasn't come out again since. The reason the White House is white is because we burnt it to the ground and they had to paint it to recover its original. The Canadians came down from the north. The Canadians love this story, right? Because Battle of Queenstown House was a final victory. Americans surrendered. So either way, what we did is we took them through a process. It took us about 4 years to develop this, by which they developed archetypal situations from those examples of American history where the Americans were being attacked by imperial powers. Then we got them to describe the events before and after 9/11 through those filters. And we had total silence and white faces around the table for about 20 minutes. I've never forgotten it. Because for the first time they were able to see something which otherwise they wouldn't have seen it because it was a gorilla. So this ability, and it was a very important question, the ability to understand the patterns through which people are filtering data and to create resonance patterns for people who have to make decisions about other people is, to my mind, one of the most important aspects of this work, but it's actually one of the most scary.
Question 4. You talked about the Kinevin framework with various domains and the behaviour and interaction you might expect within each domain. Am I right in thinking that another challenge for an organisation is, can it learn to navigate and manage the transitions between the domains?
Okay, two things. First of all, it's pronounced Kinevin. It's kind of like one of the ways we know whether we talk with somebody if they don't pronounce it properly, but it's a Welsh word. Yeah? It's also now an IBM trademark. The reason we've renamed ourselves Cognitive Edge is that IBM decided if they registered the trademark after we left, we might pay them some money, so we said to hell with it, we'll rebrand, all right? So it's the name of the model, anybody can use it because it's cited, but it can't be used for a company or a training course, all right? So just make that clear. The second thing is, yes, the boundary crossings are critical. We call these dynamics. One of the most fundamental things in terms of the anti-terrorist system is to understand when something is moving across boundaries. You actually can't predict a terrorist event. Yeah, just assume that you can't. I mean, people are putting a huge amount of technology into this, but it's not going to happen because terrorism is an unordered, complex or chaotic phenomena. What's important is you realise when a situation is destabilising, it's moving from being complicated, where your experts are probably getting it right, to being complex, where you need to move into multiple probes. So the way we use the model is each of those domains and subdomains is defined literally by thousands of examples of our past history. Because the way human beings understand things is by relating to things they already know. So we socially construct the model based on people's own history in their decision group. So they can say, if it's like that, then it's at this stage. So there's not a logical set of rules which says it's moving across this boundary. It says it's like these 5 things that we agreed indicated that something was moving across the boundary. That's key to the 3 basic problems of sense making, which wasn't on the slide. Do I see the data? Do I pay attention to the data? Do I act on the data? Now, traditional decision theory says they're synonymous. If you see the data, you'll act on it. Actually, all 3 are separate. Seeing, attending, and acting are completely different. If you can resonate with previous examples, it's more likely that people will act. What then happens as data comes into the system is it's splattered across the model and matched. It doesn't matter if the matching isn't exact, because what you want to show with a time bar at the bottom is the dynamics of the shift of the incoming data. Not to say what it means, but to say what type of system is in operation so you can deploy the effective mechanism. Now that's the big breakthrough in Singapore. It'll all get presented in March, big conference in Singapore on this. Yeah? It also means you can choose which tools to use. So the minute you move from complicated to complex, you stop doing scenario planning, you stop building in your experts, you start to introduce diversity, you use wisdom of crowds, you start to throw questions out literally to tens or 15s of thousands of people in order to find a new perspective or a new way of working on it. The other thing which works very well in boundary transition is actually this. This is something Cynthia Kurtz, who I write with, created, and to be honest, I ignored her on this for some time, as a result of which I've had promised to confess my failure on all future occasions when I use it, so bear witness I did it, all right? Fundamentally, thinking about what you want to do, if the centre is losing control, you're shifting in that direction. But if you want to shift, which comes back to your question, you let loose of control, but you increase network connectivity. That's what social network stimulation does. If you want to bring chaos back into simple, you operate a radical command and control environment. If you want to shift it into complex for higher resilience, then actually you increase network connectivity and you stand aside from the process a bit and see what actually works. So we discovered that the visual metaphor and defining the model based on examples from people's own history can actually overcome the problem to some extent, but not completely. You'll never overcome it completely.
Question 5. You were describing basically the idea that there can be observed or perceived patterns based on narrative. Have you ever tried relating that to possible patterns generated by classical rule-based induction, which might be novel and challenging?
This looks at the basic problem you've addressed, yeah? And it's a 2x2 matrix because that's nice and comfortable and we all know the good stuff's in the top right, all right? So basically, if we deal with simple input, simple output, that's process re-engineering, the analogy of a machine. Yep. If you deal with complex input, simple output, that's systems dynamics, learning organisation, for those of you familiar. Yep. And really, that's techno-fabulous. This is nearly always Art Luddite. Yep. if you look at its structure. This assumes you can drag things through by common missions, values and objectives. When you move to simple input, complex output, that's where you're into simulations, complexity theory, rule-based induction. Robot swarms particularly useful because they interact with a physical environment as well as a virtual environment. In fact, one of the projects I've just funded through the EPSRC, where I'm Director of Research on Emergence, is to bring together an ant's nest and a robot swarm and use them to create alternative modelling environments. And that's really interesting because you can model human systems using ants and you get radically different approaches. The area we're in with narrative is at that top right, which is complex. Yeah. And the argument is you start in that domain, then you can shift problems into the simplicities. If you stay in the simplicities, you never break out. But now to the point. These guys have historically confused correlation with causation. What they do is they study the past, they identify a pattern from that past, and they assume, because they can correlate behaviour, they can cause it. So these 50 companies do X. Yeah, they're all successful. So if you do X, you too will be successful. Now, the way that's taught in philosophy is if you go to France and see the first 5 people you see are wearing glasses, you shouldn't conclude that all Frenchmen wear glasses, and you shouldn't certainly conclude if you put on glasses you will become French. But every article in the Harvard Business Review and every management textbook for the last 100 years has assumed if you put on glasses you will become French, because they've confused correlation with causation. The trouble with these guys is they confuse simulation with prediction. The fact I can build a model of bird behaviour, for example, fly to the centre of the flock, match speed, avoid collision, and I can simulate the way that birds fly around in the sky, doesn't mean I can predict whether they'll go left or right of the mountain the next time they hit it, because that's a singularity with an uncertain outcome. So avoiding correlation and causation, avoiding simulation and prediction, understanding the limits, means you can use them. As long as you think that's the totality of the universe, and the trouble is government at the moment thinks the totality of the universe is here, then actually you're working with a very, very restricted mindset and you're going to get things badly wrong.
David Snowden can be contacted by email at Snowden, spelt Sierra November Oscar Whiskey Delta Echo November, at Mac, spelt Mike Alpha Charlie, .com.